Orleans, there are Frenchmen everywhere. Your house could fall down, your baby could drown. Wouldn't one of those Frenchmen care? Everybody gather round, loosen up your suspenders, hunker down on the ground. I'm a cracker, you want to, don't I take good care of you? Who built the highway to Baton Rouge? Who put up the hospital and built your school? Who looked after shit kickers like you? The Kingfish do.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I'm your host, Colin Woodward. Thank you for listening to the podcast. On today's show, I have Robert Mann. Bob is back to discuss his latest book, Kingfish U, Huey Long and LSU, a very interesting, well-written, well-researched book. I enjoyed reading it quite a bit. It moves along as quickly as anything I've ever read. And Bob has some experience. It seems like he was just on the podcast, and he's been putting out books at a impressive rate. Last time I talked to him about his memoir of working in Louisiana and Louisiana politics and his time at LSU. And for a long time in Louisiana, a lot of ways it really hasn't changed very much since Huey Long's time. And in some ways, LSU has not changed very much since Huey put his stamp on the university. Now, how did he do that? Well, he was very hands-on with LSU and pretty much everything. He was governor. He was also senator of Louisiana, and there was some overlap there where he was an elected U.S. senator in the 1930s, but was basically still governor too. He had a puppet governor. He was in Baton Rouge a lot, running through bills and barking orders and telling people what to do, as Huey did. He was pretty much a dictator of Louisiana in a time where authoritarian leaders were getting elected. Obviously, you have Germany and the Soviet Union with their own particular dictators. Not as bad in the U.S., but Huey, by American standards, was definitely running things as a one-man show. The buck stopped with him, you could say, and he did some good. He did a lot of things that were of dubious legality, we might say, and there wasn't much accountability. He might have gotten some legal trouble had he lived. His associates did after Huey was assassinated. So the Huey Long story is a long and interesting story. I don't think Hollywood has done it justice. I have not seen All the King's Men, the black and white old movie. I've read the book. It's a great book written by Robert Penn Warren, who was a professor at LSU in the heyday of Huey Long. He didn't write the book till after he left LSU. But you had people like Robert Penn Warren, Clenneth Brooks, T. Harry Williams would come on later. But LSU has quite a history as an academic institution. A lot of the novel Confederacy of Dunces had to do with LSU. I don't think it's named, but it's definitely LSU, the history department and everything, because Ignatius Riley is a history guy. But without going down that rabbit hole, it has a great tradition of writers and historians and other folks. And Huey really put it on the map. I mean, he was all about getting LSU the money it needed, the faculty it needed, and he really fell in love with the football team, which is a lot of what this book is about. If you were to say LSU today, most people would immediately think, Tigers football, and it is huge. I got there in 1997. I was a sports fan, more of a baseball guy, but I grew up liking the Patriots and the Celtics and knew what it was like to experience a championship team with the Celtics. But LSU football was at another level. It was pretty extreme, and it was not my favorite thing about being LSU. I actually had a lot of issues with it. They would shut down the library on day games, and it would shut down early if there was a Saturday night game. So Saturday night, pretty much Baton Rouge shut down, all about the football. Roads would go one way, into the stadium and into the LSU campus. So if you had something to do, you did it Friday night or Sunday, or you went out of town, because it was all about the football on game days. And it was only 5 or 6 weeks a year, I think, because they play 11 games, I think. But it was just so huge and so overwhelming. And I was not used to it. I didn't grow up there, so I didn't really get it. But it is huge, and it still is. And LSU has been very successful, not just the football team, but the baseball team, basketball team, some other teams there. And Huey is really responsible for that. But as Bob shows in his book, or he suggests on the podcast, Huey might have some issues with the way things are run today. A lot of the focus has been taken off of academics way more than it ever has been. And football still reigns supreme, and they get everything they need, the money, the coaches, and the facilities. But the library has been suffering for a long time. They supposedly got a big appropriation recently, but Bob tells me that might never actually happen, that $150 million. It's going to be a struggle to rebuild the library. So definite issues with priorities, and it's all laid out in this book, which I really liked it. I really recommend. If you went to LSU, you definitely need to read this. But if you haven't, I mean, this is a really good history of the time. It's not just about LSU. It's kind of a story about the South and a story about politics, because this is just one small part of what Huey Long is doing in Louisiana. It's pretty amazing, all the things he did do, for good or ill. He was just kind of a manic guy that liked to get things done. And I think he had a true love for LSU and Louisiana. Now, a lot of parts of Louisiana didn't share in the largesse. He was a lot about Baton Rouge and, building roads in certain parts of the state. But there was a rivalry with New Orleans and Baton Rouge that we're going to talk about. So it was definitely contentious times, and he was a controversial figure. And again, this needs the Hollywood treatment. I mean, this stuff kind of is beyond belief. And if you were writing a novel about it, as Penn Warren did, if you're telling the truth in the novel, people might not believe it. And they're like, "Oh, you're making that up." But if you're telling the truth about what's going on here, it is really shocking that this stuff actually happened. So it is a great story. And even though Huey, was not an easy guy to like, you've got to admire his ambition and his energy. And LSU grew by leaps and bounds in that time period. So, I'm proud to say I went to LSU. I got a terrific education in the history department. I had my issues with the sports there, but it was a place where you could kind of find yourself. And I loved going to the library and doing research, and the campus is beautiful. And in a lot of ways, I miss the LSU campus. Not sure about Baton Rouge generally, but I have a lot of fond memories of walking around under the live oaks and talking with my grad school friends and enjoying those nice October days, which will be coming up. So it's going to cool down there eventually. And it's just a beautiful time of year, the fall. So the football team certainly benefits from that. These perfect fall days where people tailgate and have a great time. And again, not my scene, but you put up with it until December, and then things kind of went back to normal there. So anyway, Bob's book, Kingfish U, we're going to talk a lot about it because there is a lot going on in this book, and I hope you'll enjoy my talk with Robert Mann.
Here come the kingfish, kingfish.
Yeah, I'm glad we can talk again. How's your summer going?
It's going really well. I've been busy running around the state. A lot of people want to talk about the book, which has been really nice.
Great.
And I'm finishing up another book, so I'm kind of juggling 2 books right now. But I've been busy, but it's been fun.
Yeah, you've been productive. What's the book you're working on now?
The working title is "You Are My Sunshine: Jimmy Davis and the Biography of an American Song." Okay.
Yeah, well, last time you were on, you were talking about the Huey Long book, so it just seems like you kind of have overlapping projects, which is impressive. And, sometimes, I mean, no offense to certain...
That's what it is.
What's that?
It's a problem. It's a compulsion.
Yeah, you've had that Huey Long drive, I guess, to keep publishing. But sometimes with authors, like they'll say it's coming out, it might take another year or even two. But I mean, you've been on deadline, so I'm impressed, and
Thank you.
I enjoyed the last book. I enjoyed this one a lot too. So congratulations on it.
And
And
how's your book done?
it's okay. I haven't gotten any royalties yet, so I'm not really sure how many copies it sold.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't really been doing a whole lot to promote it. I did podcasts I've done before, and that does what it does. I guess there's in the first 6 months I was doing a bit more, and just I started a new job in April, so that's taking up most of my
Okay.
week. But it just seems like it's in your blood with us. So yeah, I'm just really impressed, and this is a solid academic book. I mean, your
Thank you.
sources and everything. So I mean, obviously you're in Baton Rouge, you're at LSU, you've been there a long time, politics, you've worked in politics, but why did you want to write this book specifically?
Well, it's one of those books that literally came to me almost like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't. You usually, as you know, when you are thinking about writing a book, you want to let it marinate for a while. You don't want to just jump into a project because you want to be pretty sure that a year or two from now you're still waking up in the morning excited about the topic and not wishing you had not taken it on, because it is a big commitment, and you want to finish it, but you also want to be enthusiastic about it. So all my other books I've taken a long time, or a good, I've waited till I was sure I wanted to do the book before I decided to do the book. And this just came to me when a friend called me on the phone one day asking some questions about Huey and LSU. He thought maybe I knew the answer to, and I pulled down T. Harry Williams' biography of Huey from my shelf and read the chapter on LSU and Huey Long. And I'm not lying. After I finished those 34 pages, I thought to myself, this is a book, and I'm going to write that book. And from that moment forward, I was working on the book.
Yeah. Well, just briefly, I mean, I know what you do, but maybe people who didn't catch the first podcast. You're not in the history department at LSU, but just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So I'm this kind of odd duck. I'm a professor in the Manship School of Mass Communication at Louisiana State University. I I hold a chair in journalism, and while I worked as a journalist for a number of years, I don't actually teach a lot of journalism. I teach political communication because I worked in politics for many years, and all my writing has pretty much been in political history, though. And I'm, because I'm at a school that is not particularly, they're not really persnickety about what kind of research we do. And a lot of my research is about political rhetoric, so it does fit somewhat into our department. But most of what I write is political history, and lately I've taken more of an interest in writing about Louisiana political history.
Were you kind of surprised that there really hasn't been a book about this? Or
I was.
Yeah.
I was. In fact, when the next thing I did after I said, "Well, I'm going to write this book," is I contacted one of the editors that I work with at LSU Press. I'm also the editor of a book series, so I know a lot of people over there. And I said, I've got this idea, and they came back to me immediately and said, it's kind of weird because it surprises us that no one has written this book before. It was everybody that I've had this conversation with has said, it's just kind of amazing that no one thought to do this before. Sometimes these ideas are just hiding in plain sight, I guess.
Well, that's kind of the thing with LSU. I mean, when I went there, my first year was 97, 98, and it was palpable, his legacy on the campus. I mean, you talk a lot about this. I mean, all the buildings that are built, the field house, especially where I would go swimming sometimes, it's named after him. And with everything with Huey, there's a story behind it. So it felt kind of like you're sort of learning about Long, maybe a little through osmosis a bit, just by being on campus. But the fact that no one actually wrote a whole book about this is pretty surprising. But I'm guessing you didn't have too much trouble with sources.
No, not really.
Yeah.
the sources were the LSU special collections had a lot of what I needed, including what really persuaded me that I could do this, that there was enough material out there. Because when I started thinking about it, I realized that these are events that were 80 to 90 years old, and there weren't going to be many, if any, people around that I could interview. So,
right.
So I sent my student worker over to the library to dig through T. Harry Williams' papers, and he had done a lot of interviews for the chapter on Huey and LSU. And so when my student worker brought back the transcripts of those interviews, I realized that Williams had only used probably about 10-20% of what he had, because he was only writing one chapter about this. So then I was convinced that I had some pretty good stuff thanks to Harry Williams and what he left LSU. His papers are really a gold mine.
And I'm guessing Huey Long was not a guy that wrote a lot of stuff down. Is that accurate? Yeah.
Yeah, and there just are really there's no comprehensive collection of his papers. It's hard. It's the documents, the records management in this state has been really, really poor. And Long, I found out later, I'm friends with one of Huey's granddaughters, and she told me a couple of years ago when I interviewed her about all this, that her grandmother, the Huey had told his wife Rose, her grandmother, that if I die, I want you to burn all my papers. And she said her father, who was Russell Long, Senator Russell Long, came home one day from college to Shreveport and saw smoke rising from the backyard, and walked around and saw his mother out burning all of Huey's papers. And wow. It's just a tragedy that so much was. So when I went to do this, there just really wasn't much from Huey's on, there really wasn't much from Huey himself that I found, a little bit in Russell Long's papers, but not much. And then a guy we just went around collecting a lot of Huey Long documents and memorabilia and papers, and donated it all to the Tulane Library. And that was probably the richest collection of Huey Long papers, but there wasn't much.
That's interesting, because I had that problem in Arkansas. Like, there was no retention schedule for governor's papers, so they could go anywhere. You might be looking for something as in Little Rock, or it could be in Fayetteville or Jonesboro, whatever. They're spread all over.
Yep.
But I guess also, if you're essentially running a criminal enterprise, which is what he was doing, you might want to burn everything at some point, but that's being a little harsh. I mean, some people throughout history have just done that. They've wanted all their papers destroyed, whether or not they were up to no good. And you lay it all out toward the end of this book, but like the law came down on these guys after Huey was assassinated, and had he lived, maybe they would have come for him too. Whether he would have been convicted or not.
Well, they tried to come for him. But yeah, So I think I think a lot of the papers though were, some of what that I found from correspondence from state departments, the governor's office, and others, are preserved in the LSU archives, because there was a letter that was sent to someone at LSU, or a document that was in LSU's possession that has been retained. And so I was able to get a lot of that. And I wasn't trying to write a book about Huey's, his personal finances or his deals and all that kind of stuff, because that wasn't the focus of my story. And by the time that people started really stealing from the university, Huey had been dead. So I was able to find a lot of documentation in the LSU archives about the misdeeds of James Monroe Smith and others, because the LSU board, after the fact, had to deal with a lot of that and had hired accounting firms to investigate it. And so there was a lot of that still in the record, which was helpful to me.
I think the elephant in the room with this is our current political climate and the last presidential administration. Because I knew who Huey Long was, and it was a bit of a culture shock just coming to LSU, but also learning all these things about Long. I'm like, this is really crazy. This is kind of unprecedented, like running this dictatorship. this couldn't possibly happen at the bigger level in terms of the U.S. government. But I mean, this is a pretty current story, don't you think? I mean, again and again, I'm like, this is a very kind of Trumpy guy who's just sort of doing whatever he wants and doesn't have a whole lot of respect for the law or the Constitution of the state. Is that a happy coincidence for you? Do you think people will see those connections?
Yeah, people do see the connections, and I do think that there are valid, legitimate comparisons. The one distinction that I think is important is that, best I can tell, Donald Trump never built anything for any, with any kind of altruistic motive in mind. And I'm not saying that
right,
an altruist, but whether he was stealing or raking off the top, or whether the people around him were doing that, at the end of the day, there was something to show for it. There were roads and bridges and a university that was serving people. And so I'm not saying that just because you provide a public benefit, you're entitled to skim off the top. But I do think there is a distinction that at least he left something of use to current and future generations.
No, I agree, and I think in some ways this is maybe the best part of one of the best parts of his legacy is what he does do for LSU. And yeah, maybe the ends don't justify the means with it, but I mean, you talk about this, but I think he had a legitimate love for LSU and especially the football team, and wanted LSU to do well and compete with other universities. Now with him, there's always that kind of puffery of like, this is, again, it's kind of Trumpy, like this is the best university in the country or one of the best. It's like, okay, whatever. But he certainly was bringing it up to kind of a 20th century standard, I guess you could say. But before we go further, again, people hearing this might not really know who Huey Long is or know much about him. So let's just maybe go back a bit and just talk about where he comes from, how he amasses all this power in the state, how he becomes governor, and then later senator. So maybe just kind of talk about him briefly as his background.
Yeah, that might be helpful. Yeah, so he comes from Winfield, Louisiana, which is in north central Louisiana, rural parish, where there was a lot of agrarian unrest after the Civil War. This was not a part of the state that was particularly pro Confederacy. Upcountry, there weren't a lot of big plantations. Slavery was not the predominant part of the economy because of the way that they were mostly, small farms, and so there was a lot of liberal agrarian sentiment up there that was that I think sort of shaped a lot of the politics and just the ethic of that area. And Huey came of age in that period, born in 1898, and growing up surrounded by people whose livelihoods weren't really improved by the Civil War or by Reconstruction, and so he was probably one of the smartest non formally educated person that's ever led this state. I mean, this is a guy who did not even graduate high school. Not really, I think, by his own fault, but whatever reason, he didn't graduate high school, didn't have really any college education, managed to go to Tulane and take 3 or 4 courses in law, and sat for the bar exam, which was an acceptable way of becoming a lawyer in those days. Even into the 1960s, I think in Louisiana, you didn't have to have a law degree to become a lawyer if you could pass the bar exam. But he passed the bar exam and became a successful attorney back in Winfield, and at a very young age ran for the Public Service Commission, ran for governor in 1924, sort of narrowly lost that race, so he kept running, and in 1928 became governor. And he's only in his late 30s at the time. This is a very young man and very much a man in a hurry, and becomes governor, and really in a lot of ways just breaks up the old power structure that had been running the state and running it for its own benefit. We talk about Long's corruption and his authoritarian nature, I think it's important to remember that the Bourbons who were running the state when Long took over weren't providing a whole lot of benefits for the people. There were very few usable roads in this state. The schools were in pitiful condition, and he set about trying to change that. And so the story of what he did to transform LSU is sort of in microcosm what he did for the rest of the state. Really dragged it into the 20th century because so much of its needs, education, infrastructure, social welfare had just been completely ignored by all the people who'd been running the state for the last few generations.
Yeah, and there's this rivalry between, I don't know if it really exists before long, but there's really a rivalry between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, right? Politically, culture, whatever. Like New Orleans, much older, more established, bigger. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I kind of like to think of the rivalry between New Orleans and Baton Rouge as today the rivalry between Baton Rouge and Lafayette, LSU and University of Louisiana. It's a one-way rivalry.
Yeah.
The people in Baton Rouge resented Tulane in New Orleans, and New Orleans probably never gave Baton Rouge a second thought except when the legislature was in session. But people here were sort of obsessed by and sort of offended by the way that the high society, well-educated, urban people look down their nose at this backwater, little small town of Baton Rouge that had a really middling state university that really had not made its mark on the state or the nation in really any significant way. And to me, that's the story to me, that's the amazing thing about what Huey did in the story of the book is that he took this middling school, this undistinguished school that no one really outside Louisiana knew anything about, and made it into a relative academic powerhouse. I mean, it was never on par with Yale and Harvard like he wanted to say, but within a couple of years, it became a university where a lot of impressive scholars like Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks and a whole host of others were willing to leave their nice jobs at other more established universities and come down here to Baton Rouge to make their mark. And they did. And he did this all within 2 or 3 years, which to me is the most remarkable thing about it. If you said, here was LSU in 1925, 1928, and here is LSU in 1938, 1940, how long do you think it took for this university to go from that to this? And you would have said maybe 20, 30 years would have been pretty impressive. He did it all in 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's certainly impressive, a lot of things that he does. But I mean, as you discover when you're doing your research, this is just kind of the tip of the iceberg in some ways with Huey Long. I mean, one chapter in T. Harry Williams' book, which is like 700 pages long or whatever. I mean, he's doing so many other things on top of, having time to drive to the practice field and get on there with football players. I mean, it's just, when did this guy sleep? It's just astounding. But just one more thing about New Orleans and Baton Rouge, that tension, that rivalry, do you still kind of see that today between Baton Rouge and New Orleans?
I do. And I think there's always been an estrangement between the two cities.
Yeah.
People in New Orleans just don't the thing is, New Orleans is a separate entity, a separate state, separate country to itself. I mean, it's just
right.
It's just not fully integrated into the rest of Louisiana. I mean, it always amazes me the number of people who live in New Orleans who've never been to Baton Rouge, never spent any time in Baton Rouge, and certainly have never been to places like Alexandria, Monroe, or Shreveport. My wife, who grew up in Louisiana, had only been to Monroe one time before we got married, and she went with me to promote a book. She just, people from South Louisiana in general, but especially in New Orleans, just aren't familiar with the rest of the state. And New Orleans, a lot of New Orleans people really look down on Baton Rouge as still being that backwater town with no culture, no good restaurants. It's got a good football team, but that's about it. And they weren't always wrong about that. But these are two different, 80 miles apart, but two different worlds.
Yeah. Well, and not to bust on Baton Rouge too hard, but it does kind of feel like a city that didn't exist before Huey Long. I mean, it's like you see the Art Deco Capitol, you see LSU in 20s and in the 1930s and stuff. You try to find older evidence of the city. It's a little more difficult than New Orleans, which French Quarter's still there. It's all as much as they've screwed up their own history, it's pretty palpable. But yeah, I felt it when I was there too. The people from New Orleans kind of looked down a bit on the people from Baton Rouge, and people from Baton Rouge are like, you're just a bunch of stuck up people who can't play football. And when's the last time LSU even played Tulane? Do you know?
I don't know. It's been a while. It's been a long time, and that's the remarkable thing, because it was the rivalry between those two schools, and for the last probably decade that LSU played Tulane really didn't have much of a football program. But in the period that I'm writing about, Tulane had the better team. Tulane had the even as good as LSU football became in the 20s and 30s, Tulane was still the better team most years. Tulane was the team that Huey most wanted to beat. Tulane, even though he had more of a history with Tulane than he did with LSU. But I can't remember. It's probably been into the 70s or 80s since we last played Tulane, and I should know the answer to that question, but I don't.
And they're not even in the same caliber as LSU, right? I mean, the LSU is the SEC. What is even Tulane? Do you know?
I think is it the ACE? I don't remember now. I can't remember. I used to be the Sun Belt. I'm embarrassed to say I don't know.
That's okay.
And what's crazy to me about this book is that I when I go around to talk about it, my wife is usually with me, and I say, this is the person in the family who knows a whole lot more about football than me. I know I've taught myself a lot about football in that era, but beyond that, I'm really kind of at sea.
Yeah, well, I think Arkansas, they were sort of in the Sun Belt for a while, then they came back into the SEC. So yeah, maybe Tulane was in the Sun Belt, or still are. I don't know, but yeah, nowadays you would not put your money on Tulane to defeat LSU. It's just such a good team that they've developed, and obviously it happens with Huey Long. But let's maybe put football in context a little bit, because I was kind of surprised just the nature of football in this time period. Maybe just kind of talk about that, like how the players relate to the coach, and like how games go in terms of scoring and everything. Maybe just talk a little bit about where football is at in the late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, if I can, LSU last played Tulane on October 31st of 2009. So it wasn't that long ago.
What was the final?
42-0 LSU.
There you go. Made Huey happy, I'm sure.
And just so we don't leave anybody hanging, Tulane is in the American Athletic Conference. Okay. Whatever that is, I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds that's lower than the Sun Belt. I'm guessing. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, good to know. Go Tigers. So, well, I was kind of surprised at just how football operated back then, and just kind of talk about that.
I was too, and one thing that made a lot more sense to me about Huey's behavior. So a lot of the book is not a lot, but there's a good amount in the book about Huey's behavior around the football team, on the sidelines, injecting himself into games, writing plays, leading cheers, but really, telling the coaches and the players what to do during games, giving them instruction, yelling out instruction, making a scene, and probably in the coaches and some of the players' minds, making a nuisance of himself on the sidelines. And I didn't fully understand, even without the history that I eventually got, it seemed pretty appalling and inappropriate behavior to me. And then when I started reading about what coaching was in that era, it became even more appalling, because in those days, the coaches, in fact, it's interesting. When you read a lot of these newspaper stories from that era, the coaches are often called coach, but many times they're called, the coaches are referred to as mentors, not coaches.
Okay.
And which was I found it to be an interesting way to refer to a coach. It made more sense when I realized that the coaching that football coaches did was almost entirely during the week. That once the game began, the coaches didn't really coach. Their job was not to send in plays. Their job was not to really inject themselves into the game. We're so accustomed to every play in every football game and other sports being sort of managed by the coaches on the sideline, either calling a player over, or in the case of football, communicating through a wireless microphone and earphone and a helmet. And in those days, that was just not something that even if they had the technology, they would have been allowed to do, because the players were supposed to know what to do because they had been trained during the week, that the plan had been made during the week. And then when the game started, the coaches were supposed to leave the players alone and let them play. And maybe they were responsible for substituting if somebody needed substituting, somebody got injured, or somebody was brought out and somebody else put in. But other than that, you didn't send in plays. You didn't tell the players what to do. You might at halftime be able to make those adjustments in the locker room, but on the field, the players were supposed to do what they were trained to do. And so what Huey did was it just makes it seem all the more shocking. And the only thing that I can figure out is why he didn't get sanctioned by the referees is that he technically wasn't a coach. He was the governor, U.S. senator. And so even though he saw himself as an assistant coach, technically he wasn't. So I guess that they really didn't have the ability to sanction the team for something that a fan did. But he was a very prominent part of the team from practices through the game and even into the locker room and almost every game that he attended from 1929 on.
Yeah, it's pretty embarrassing, some of the behavior that he would do. I mean, he's kind of saw himself as both coach and mascot, so he'd be kind of behind, in front of the band and running around and trying to give speeches and all this stuff. Just drove some of the coaches totally crazy, as hands off as they were during the games, as you say. But I was kind of surprised just like how low the scoring was for a lot of these games, like a 0-0 tie, which would never happen today. So like, do you know like kind of why the games tend to be lower scoring?
No, I don't, and that's a very good question. And I didn't explore that, why there was so low scoring. And you're right. I mean, why weren't there even field goals and that kind of thing?
Right.
But I don't know. That's a very good question. That's just not something that really came up. But there were a lot of low scoring games. But then again, there were games that I write about one several seasons when teams like LSU would run up hundreds of points, unanswered points. Alabama was a good example. In the 1925 season, they ran up, I think, almost 300 unanswered, 300 points to something like 7 on the other side. So it was in some cases it was easy for one team to dominate the others. And I think that this is not an answer to your question, but I think it's another aspect of it that was a revelation to me. It also helped me understand why Huey Long cared so much about LSU and football, was that Southern football had such a poor reputation, deservedly so, in the early part of the 20th century, because it wasn't seen as being the sort of same game as was being played up east or out west. And in many cases, it was true. Southern boys just didn't know much about football. They hadn't grown up playing football. A lot of these players on these college teams had never actually played a football game before they got into college, and they were just learning about it. And so when Southern football began to be more of a thing, especially in places like Georgia and Alabama, and the greatest example of it all is the 1925 season that Alabama had, undefeated, by far the best team in college football, and yet they could not get an invite to the Rose Bowl, which was the only postseason game in college football at that time. and really the national championship game. They could not get an invite to that game until 3 or 4 other teams turned down the invite to go to the Rose Bowl, and they finally invited Alabama as sort of a consolation prize. And
Yeah.
Alabama goes out there and beats the University of Washington and vindicates Southern college football, vindicates the entire South in a way. Everywhere they went on their way back to Tuscaloosa, they would stop in whatever town in the South that they stopped in, we would hold a parade for them. And it was Alabama, Georgia, and Georgia Tech that started winning these games, started winning these national games, going to the Rose Bowl, going to Yale and beating Yale, that suddenly made Southern football respectable. And I believe that Huey Long saw that. He couldn't have helped, but he had to have seen it, as everybody in Louisiana did. And he wanted that for LSU. I think he saw, rightly so, that one path, and maybe the quickest path to respectability for a university, was on the gridiron.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think as much darkness and bad stuff there is with Huey Long, he did do some things that were very cool for the school. I know, again, you couldn't do it today. It's just ridiculous. But, like paying to have everyone get on the train to go to Tennessee to see the game. He's just giving people cash. I mean, it's
that's right.
It's just every day is Christmas when Huey's around sometimes. So I kind of like reading those stories because, of course, it wouldn't happen today, and it's just total favoritism. But at some level, it's kind of cool. He's into it. Everyone's there, the band and the cadets and the players and everything. So I kind of like reading those stories, as infuriating all this other stuff is. But obviously, this is totally changed. Like you said, like the South not being great at football, how could that be? And LSU is right in there with all those teams you just named, Alabama, so on. And it's just become such a big time thing, for better or for worse. But for a while, Huey tries to kind of stay impartial, right? Like the first couple of years of his governorship, he doesn't want to be all in on LSU. He's still trying to kind of walk this line between LSU and Tulane. Is that accurate?
Yeah, he would go to he was on the governing board as an ex officio member as governor of the Tulane governing board as well. And Tulane had and still does have a sort of a quasi public relationship with the state. And because he had that, because it was New Orleans and it was a big, important politically, and also because he had some, he'd attended law school at Tulane. He had a lot of connections to Tulane, and I think he was being very careful in the beginning not to show that favoritism. So he would go to when the two teams played each other, he would go to the game and sit with the LSU fans for the first half, and then cross the field and sit with the Tulane fans on the second half. He did that for the first 2 or 3 years, and then it became when he went all in on LSU, it became just he wasn't hostile to Tulane necessarily. He wasn't trying to hurt Tulane, but he just dropped the pretense that he was equally supportive of both teams, because it was impossible not to, it was impossible to pretend otherwise. I mean, he was so clearly in on LSU, and Tulane would have probably welcomed his attention in a lot of ways, but Tulane was an established university. They didn't need him as much as LSU did, so it didn't.
Right.
I don't find that it really seemed to offend Tulane people as much as it delighted LSU people.
Yeah, and with Huey too, it's kind of like Trump. It's like the line between the personal and the political isn't always very clear. I mean, I think obviously backing LSU out of Baton Rouge was good politics for him to a certain degree. But as you say, he had the connections to Tulane in terms of law school. Had he been from New Orleans, we're probably talking about a totally different guy, totally different story. But I think he just got so into being behind LSU because for personal reasons, but also it did help him politically. I'm backing the underdog against, these guys in New Orleans, and he could really just kind of put his stamp on LSU in a way he couldn't somewhere else. But let me talk a bit about that, or I should say, have you talk about that. Kind of what's the state of LSU when Huey arrives? Kind of how's the school doing? He does all these changes, but where is it at? And whenever he's governor, was it 28?
Yeah.
just talk about the history of the university a bit.
Yeah, so it was a small school, and it was, I think there was probably about 1,500 students, 1,700 students, something like that at the time. It was divided between two campuses. You know, the previous campus was on the property where the state capitol is today, on the banks of the Mississippi River, north of downtown Baton Rouge. The women students were still living on the old campus, taking a train in the morning down to the new campus. It was still sort of divided between these two campuses, although LSU had made a very decided effort to move everything south because they just needed more land for agricultural experiments and what else. They were landlocked where they were. But the people who had done this before Huey, Governor John Parker and others, their ambition for the university was really not that bold. I mean, they wanted a better agricultural university, but they really didn't see it as being anything greater beyond that. And even when they talked about in their wildest imaginations for LSU's enrollment, they talked about it in terms of maybe 3,000 students one day. And so Huey becomes governor in 1928, and he had actually, strangely enough, opposed selling the old campus and moving it south. I don't think because he had any real affection for the old campus, but because it was John Parker's idea, and he was a political enemy of John Parker, and he was campaigning around the state as sort of a break with John Parker, and he called the new campus John Parker's Temple of Vanity. But when he became governor, he quickly got on board with supporting the new campus, and you know, for some of the reasons that I've talked about earlier about football, I think he just became more interested in the university as a way to burnish his own reputation, to build his own name, to build the reputation of the state on the back of football. I think there's also an aspect of it in 1928, 29, especially after he was almost impeached. A lot of the anti-Long newspapers had sort of blacked him out. You know, they were not covering him, and he was a little bit despondent about his inability to get into the newspapers. And I think this is mostly circumstantial, but I think it's pretty good circumstantial evidence that he saw associating himself with LSU football as a way to get back into those newspapers, and in a way that didn't associate himself with any sort of partisan political issue, but with something that everybody, you know, liked and cared about, which was, you know, winning football. And so it worked. I mean, it got him not only into Louisiana papers, but national papers. And I think that while maybe football was his football and the band, by the way, he really wanted a better band and he got it. But I think beyond the sort of the spectacle of football and band, I think he knew that he had to have a better, that it couldn't be all about the band. It couldn't be all about football. It couldn't be all this superficial stuff. He had to have a better university. And so he very quickly began getting very much behind selling that land that was still owned by LSU around where the Capitol is now, selling it to the state for the building of the Capitol, but also to the state highway department, and using that money to undertake a very ambitious building project here on this campus. And very, you know, as I said earlier, very quickly the feel around this university began to change, and it became apparent to people in Louisiana, but outside Louisiana, that this was a different university. And it was a different university because it had a governor who not only cared about it, because other governors had cared about it, but a governor who was devoting so much energy and finding the money to do what needed to be done. That had never really happened in this big a way.
Yeah, and some of it's pretty shady, but at the same time, there's the record keeping. You talk about one incident with I can't remember if it's the English department. One of the departments, yeah. They didn't even have a breakdown of who was making what. There was no budget, essentially.
Yeah. So, that was Fred Fry, who, when he became the dean of the School of Social Sciences, went to see the former dean or whatever, and said, "I want a list of all the faculty and what they make." And the guy refused to give it to him. Then he went to the business manager, and that guy said, you can't have it. So he finally went to the president, and they gave him the information, and he discovered that there were all kinds of, it was all a mess, and instructors were being paid more than professors, and that, it was just that people weren't, not only they weren't being paid, but no one really knew what they were being paid. And it was just a small time operation in so many ways. I mean, it was just one of the examples is the band director that Huey wanted to fire. That was really one of the first things he did. And my book starts out with Huey coming to the campus in November of 1930 to see the president to demand that the band director be fired. And he got his wish eventually. But the band director was a guy named Pop Gilbo, who was the director of this little ragtag 37-piece band. But the thing I love about it is that Pop Gilbo was not only the band director, he was also the custodian of grounds. So, so the school had a guy who was basically in charge of mowing the grass, also leading the band. And that's just what a small time operation this was.
And when you talk about LSU, the state of Louisiana buys the campus downtown, correct, to pay for the new campus? Is that what happened?
Well, so yes and no. So the land for the new campus was actually purchased in 1919 by the state for about $82,000, and they started the building of it. And by 1924, there was a campus here, and that was done because they found some revenue from oil and gas revenue that they could dedicate to LSU for about 5 years. That money ran out, and then from 1925 to 1930, the state was not really supporting LSU like it had, and the university was sort of limping along on a meager appropriation and no money for new construction. So most of the buildings that were built here at first were from 1920, 21 and through 24, and then everything kind of ground to a halt. And Huey in the early 1930s got that started again when he found the money to reinvigorate the building program here by selling that land that LSU owned to the state, and he did it in a legally dubious way. I mean, he knew that he was probably crossing a line, and and there were people who sued the state alleging that it was done improperly. And Huey's attitude was, let's get the money, let's spend it as fast as possible, get those buildings in place. So even if we lose the lawsuit, no one can take the building away from us.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, it sounded like the state essentially paid itself for the
Well, that's what happened. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. What are you supposed to do? Issue bonds or something? How are you supposed to do that?
Well, you should do it one of two ways, and they still do it one of two ways, by either issuing bonds or by a direct appropriation for the. But yeah, there may be some example of. I mean, LSU owned the land, and I guess they technically could have sold it to an outside entity. And in fact, I think LSU did that up through the 50s when they owned a lot of that. They still owned some land in and around downtown Baton Rouge. But yeah, I'm not sure. Although, best I can tell, there was a state judge. He may have been a long ally who ended up approving the process.
Well, and I think that was a lot of what Huey was about. By the time people figure out the legality or the workability of this, we're just going to move forward.
That's right. I mean, the thing that even before I started this book, the thing that always impressed me about Long was just his audacity. I mean, in every aspect of his life. I mean, this was a guy who just didn't have the same kind of mental checks and balances in his mind. I can go this far, but not that far, or I can get away with this, but I can't get away with that. He just had no conception of that anybody could tell him no, and that anything he decided to do, wasn't, as long as it resulted in him notching a win, why not? And so it was just, and that paid off for him in a lot of ways. I mean, I think it also almost cost LSU its accreditation, but and his assassination saved the school in some ways. But there was just an audacity about him that was, if you were on his good side and you were the beneficiary, you loved it. But if not, you might very well have gotten bulldozed.
Yeah, there's definitely a climate of fear here in this book with, people don't want to offend long. It goes down to the level of students who are basically expelled for what they're doing, the newspaper and everything. But just before I get into the next thing, just to put in perspective a little, when Huey gets there, there's about how many students did you say? 1,500?
About 1,700.
Okay, and it grows to what by the time he's gone?
By the time he's gone, it's about 6,000.
Okay, so no doubt. I mean, the university is growing by leaps and bounds in this time period. And now it's what, 35,000 students?
Yeah, 34, 35.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, it's the change is pretty palpable. Maybe just talk about some of the other things that he does. I mean, we talked about that a little bit, but maybe just the construction or just kind of how he adds to the campus physically.
Yeah, and he does. He builds a lot. And what impresses me, I was just looking at this morning, not in preparation for this interview so much, but I had noticed that there was a date on the Huey Long field house that's just been newly renovated. The date on the outside is wrong, and so I was trying to help the people who are doing the work to get the right name, get the right date on the building. And so I pulled some of my records, and it was reminded that this building, which today I think the renovation of the building has taken almost 2 years. It's already there, but they've taken 2 years to renovate it. In that they called for bids on that building in May of 1931. They opened the bids in June of 1931, and it was opened for business in May of 1932. They built it in under a year, and it's taken over 2 years to renovate it. I mean, they did everything so quickly. He decided in the fall of 1930 that LSU needed a medical school because Tulane had the only medical school in the state, and he didn't think that, and he was right, that Tulane was churning out enough doctors for Louisiana, and many of them weren't Louisiana. People are going to stay in Louisiana and practice, and we just need more doctors. And so we got to have a med school. And so a year later, they had a med school. I mean, to me, it's just remarkable. Not just that he had the vision to do this stuff. And I realized there was no OSHA in those days. There was no Environmental Protection Agency. There wasn't a lot of government regulations and hoops to jump through that you would have today. But I also think it's remarkable that the best built buildings on this campus, the buildings that no one would ever tear down, even if they weren't historically significant, are the buildings that were built in the 20s and 30s, because they're just built. They're just solid. The guy that runs facility services, the way he described them to me, is they have really good bones. I mean, they're just really good buildings. Yeah. The buildings they want to tear down are the ones that were built in the 1950s and after. They were just shoddy construction. And so
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's just amazing to me that they not only did it in a hurry, but they actually left, these really good, solid buildings and institutions that have survived and thrived into the 21st century. I just think it's remarkable how quickly they did it. And so when I go around talking about the book, one of the things I talk about is, we talk about what it would take to fix higher education's problems in Louisiana and everywhere else. We talk about it like it's brain surgery or rocket scientists and science, or how do we do this? And I think if Huey were here, he would say, y'all need to get your heads out of the clouds here and realize that none of what you're talking about is going to happen unless you just start spending some money. You got to start building. You got to get busy building. And he took, to repeat myself, he took a middling, undistinguished university in a backwater town and made it into a nationally recognized university. in 2 or 3 years. And he did it just because he put the full force of the state behind it. If we decided to do it again, it wouldn't take us as long as we think it would. We could do it again, and we wouldn't do it the same way he did it. We would have to, there'd be a lot more rules we'd have to follow, but it's not rocket science. And I think we need to quit talking about it or treating it like it's some mystery how to make LSU a better school.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I mean, even when I was there, I was kind of amazed at how generous the scholarships were for undergraduates with the TOPS program, which I think was a Republican. Was that Murphy Foster? Was that Governor Foster's program?
Yeah, that was, well, it was, I think it was Foster, but it was certainly a program that was supported by Republicans.
Yeah.
And still is. I mean, it's still, still a pretty good bipartisan consensus around the TOPS program. But, they had a TOPS program in those days, too. Everybody got it. If you got into LSU, if you could get into LSU and you were a Louisiana resident, you were not charged any tuition. As long as you could come up with room and board, you could come to LSU and get a pretty good education. And even into the, and I think this clearly applies to almost every state in the nation until costs in higher education started going up. But, when I went to school in the late 70s, early 80s, and I never paid more than $120 a semester in tuition. I mean, it was just states really heavily subsidized higher education through most of the 20th century, and it's a shame we've gotten away from that.
Yeah, absolutely. Which building are you in at LSU?
I'm in I'm in Campbell Hodges Hall, which is another wonderful thing about writing this book, because I'd been in this building for years and didn't know anything about Campbell Hodges, except that I vaguely knew that he'd been president of the university in the 50s. But now I know a lot more about him, and he was, and I also know about and love, and just it's a hilarious story about his run-in with Huey Long and how he was prevented from being the president of the university in the late 20s because of Huey.
Well, just real quick, do you know there's a great story about the field house when they're building it, and they're talking about how big the pool is going to be, and Huey finds out. Do you want to tell that story? I love that story.
Huey loved it. He wanted the field house built. They originally had planned a swimming pool, mostly just a swimming pool, and he insisted that there be a whole building complex around it, which eventually became the Huey Long Field House, still is, and in those days, and it became sort of the social center of campus, really the student union. And so he took great interest in it. And one day he's over there looking at the progress with Troy Middleton, who was the commandant of cadets, who later became president in the 50s. He said, "So is this?" He asks Middleton. He says, "Is this the longest swimming pool in the country?" And it was, at the time, my understanding is it was meant to be an Olympic length swimming pool. And Middleton said, he said, "I didn't know the answer to that question, but I wasn't going to let Huey know that I didn't know." So he said, I think that the swimming pool at the Naval Academy at Annapolis is longer." And Huey just on a whim turned to the construction foreman and said, "Put 10 more feet on this on the swimming pool," and they had to dig out 10 more feet. And so if you see this, so they ruined it because it was no longer Olympic.
Right.
And if you go there today, even, you'll see that the building at the back was pushed out. It was rounded to make room for those extra 10 feet. And so LSU had a really nice pool, and it was presumably the longest in the country. But it was no longer Olympic size. But Huey was more concerned about the bragging rights than anything else.
Right. Yeah. Well, maybe that segues into my next topic here. There's a lot of Freudian stuff going on with Huey. I think that maybe we don't want to go into too much, but rebuilding the Capitol from the Gothic to this big Art Deco building. There's a lot of, bullying here, but also just kind of a lot of insecurity with him. He's just very kind of thin-skinned guy at times. He'd read a editorial in the Reveille and just set him off, and it would just be hell to pay. What do you know about him kind of psychologically? Again, I don't want to play armchair therapist here, but he's certainly a manic guy. Was there kind of a flip side of that, did he just have really low moments at times? Do you know about?
It's a good question, and the way that one person I might compare him to would be somebody like Lyndon Johnson, who had these manic, depressive periods where he was all action or just fell into deep depression. I've never found any evidence of long falling into any kind of long sustained period of depression or where he was in a funk. If he was, he hit it well. The problem that he did have that maybe comes closest to that is in the 1932, 33, he had a bit of a drinking problem, and it got him into trouble when he did something in a bathroom in a Long Island club and got beat up and caused him some national embarrassment. And he went on the wagon and lost weight and sort of got himself together again. But other than that, I think he was disheartened and depressed, but more embarrassed by what had happened. But I just don't find any evidence that there was any kind of were there these moments where he would alternate between mania and depression.
Yeah, I've never really read anything like that. Sometimes you just maybe have to read between the lines a little bit if you can, where he would just he'd be at a game where he'd just kind of sit on the bench and not really do much. You kind of wonder, like, he's going through something. He's just like, I don't have it in me, but I showed up anyway.
I think he was more. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think in those situations, it was not so much depression as it just was, extreme peak. He was very sensitive to slights. He could not brook criticism of himself, not so much by anybody, but by people who he felt who worked for institutions that he controlled. So, I think that I don't find a lot of examples of him trying to, go out and get people fired who criticized him. I'm sure he did some of that, but when he really exploded was when, like the Reveille runs this letter to the editor in the fall of 1934 that doesn't even mention him by name, by the way, but is clearly criticizing his behavior around appointing a football player to the state senate, which is kind of crazy in and of itself. But he saw it as his institution and his students, his newspaper criticizing him, and that could not be allowed. That couldn't happen. And so when you see him really flip out, it's when he's being criticized mostly that way. That's not the only times he got angry at criticism, but when you see him just completely lose it, I think it was more that this is my institution. My institution, nobody in my institution gets to criticize me.
And if you were one of his, puppets, it just seems like he had certain guys that were just his punching bag. I mean, he would just be berating them constantly. I mean, you talk about O.K. Allen, who's his puppet governor. I mean, that was not an enviable position to be in.
No, he treated him really badly. And I think he treated everybody around him sort of, badly. I mean, he just didn't observe the common niceties. This was not a please and thank you kind of guy. So yeah, he could be pretty rough with people around him. But what's interesting to me is that there's this guy I write about, this little episode I write about, former football player and assistant coach at Tulane, Lester Lautenschlager, who was in the state legislature, who voted for some of the articles of impeachment. And yet, for some reason, Huey remained friendly with him. And in fact, when he felt like the football coaches weren't taking him seriously, he went to Lautenschlager and asked him to write some plays for him that Huey could turn in as his own, just to see if they were disregarding him because they were terrible plays or because they were coming from Huey Long. And Lautenschlager did it. And I just found that interesting that he managed to maintain relationships with some people that he regarded as enemies. And I think it's because, Lautenschlager didn't really owe him anything and stood up to him and he in some perverse way, like I think Lyndon Johnson, he had a respect for people who, weren't subservient, that they weren't willing to allow themselves to be bullied.
Yeah. Well, it's such a weird time period too, because everybody's a Democrat, right? I mean,
Yes.
are there any Republicans he dealt with at all?
Not that I know of. I mean, it was until through the 60s and 70s in the state, really through the 60s mostly, but it was pro and anti Long. It was,
Right.
it wasn't Democrat and Republican. It was, are you for the are you or really it was, and after Long was gone, it was not so much pro Long, anti Long, it was just pro governor, anti governor.
Yeah, it's just such a crazy time period. But kind of like, where is he at in terms of like his hold on power around the time he's assassinated? Because there are always people who are kind of against him, especially in New Orleans. You know, he's just such a overpowering figure. He had a lot of enemies, obviously. But could you sort of break down kind of like who's still for him, who's still against him? Like, would he have been good for another 5 or 6 years, or do you think his hold on power was waning despite all these things that he's doing at the end?
In some ways, his hold on power was only growing.
Okay.
He was there were a couple of, I can't remember which special session this was, but there was one special session when he was really consolidating power and taking power. Basically, a lot of it was taking power away from local governments, investing it in state government, particularly the governor's office, to dismiss and appoint local officials, appoint school teachers, that kind of thing. That was only growing, and the opposition, in some cases, were not even bothering to show up for the vote. I mean, they just knew it was fait accompli, that he had really further consolidated. He just really was getting stronger in some ways, and I think that's probably why he was assassinated, because when there's an expectation that we can beat him in the next election, or we maybe can round up enough votes to stop this thing or that thing, people don't tend to let their minds go to political violence. But I think there was such a feeling among his opponents that there's no way to stop this guy short of his death, that it allowed his enemies to, sort of encouraged his enemies to go there. I don't get into the assassination too much because I didn't want to. That's a can of worms that still in 2023 you can get a pretty fierce argument out of. I had some guy at an event the other day who wanted to debate me on the assassination of Huey Long, and I just didn't want to. I didn't want my book to be about that. But it was, I think, one reason he was assassinated, or one reason why so many. I mean, let me back up a minute. His
Sure.
the funeral of Carl Weiss, who's the alleged assassin of Huey Long, was held the day after Long was shot, the day before he actually died. So he technically Weiss was not considered the assassin at that point, but he was the guy that everybody thought had shot Huey Long. His funeral was undoubtedly, I don't think there's any question, his funeral was the best attended funeral of an American political assassin in American history. Every doctor was there. Every doctor in Baton Rouge was there. Former Governor Parker was there. He sent a flower arrangement. The district attorney, John Fred Odom, was there. The congressman, J.Y. Sanders Jr., was there. And the former dean of the LSU Law School, who Long had deposed, was also there, all to pay their respects to this guy who had just shot and mortally wounded the former governor and current U.S. senator. It's crazy.
It's so crazy. It's such a crazy time period. And it never occurred to me before, but kind of like the irony of Huey Long, who builds the medical facilities at LSU, has his surgery totally botched, right? I mean, maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, by this political appointee who was, probably a competent doctor, but not someone you'd want to do surgery on you if you'd had a gunshot wound. But that was who. Now, in Arthur Vadrine's defense, he didn't want to do the surgery. I mean, the doctors that he wanted to do the surgery got run off the road and were stuck in a ditch between New Orleans and Baton Rouge and couldn't get there in time. But it also shows you, to me, what a backwater town this was.
Right.
If someone gets shot and there's not a competent doctor in the whole city to do the surgery, we got to send to New Orleans to get a doctor.
I feel like they haven't really done this whole time period justice yet. I mean, All the King's Men is a great novel, and you talk about that. It's just a terrific book, but I feel like this should be a Netflix 6-8 part story or something where you kind of lay all this out, because it's so crazy and it's so perfect, the ending to the story. It's really kind of astounding. So it's a lot of fun to talk about this stuff. This guy who wanted to debate you, was he kind of doing a conspiratorial take
Yes.
on it? Okay.
Yes.
We don't need to talk about that,
It's just crazy. I mean,
but
and he kept, since then, he sent me several emails just telling me how wrong I am about all of this. It's just, but it's to me, it's just amazing how people have these. It's political, that's the thing. And I try to explain to you, it's political. It doesn't have much to do with the evidence. It's where you pro or anti-Long. If you're anti-Long, you didn't want him to be seen as a martyr. You wanted him to be seen as someone who was shot by his own bodyguards. And so it was, you saw the assassination through the lens of your attitude toward Long and his politics, not the facts of the case.
Well, I hope someone from Netflix or AMC is listening to this and they'll option your book into a series.
I think that's a fantastic idea.
Because you couldn't make this stuff up. I mean, if you wrote that in a screenplay and the assassin's funeral was well attended the night after you're like, no, that would never happen.
Right. I mean, that blew me away. I don't think there's anything in the book that, and it wasn't really so much connected to LSU, but it was just, I almost fell out of my chair when I read the account of this. Like, holy smokes. I mean, none of these people were ashamed to be there paying their respects to this guy. They were all proud of it because that's how respectable it was in Baton Rouge in 1935 to hate Huey Long and wish for his demise.
Yeah. It's really crazy. And maybe to kind of wrap up here, I've really been enjoying this, but I think when I was there at LSU, you still had a lot of people that were aware of the Long legacy. I think John Roderick, who was doing Louisiana history, he took a poll. Students said, who's the most important guy in Louisiana history? And Huey Long clearly was in the lead. Do you still think people have that awareness now of what he's done and also what he's done for LSU?
No, I don't. I think there's still some people who obviously know about him. I have a student who knows a lot about Long and really wants, even before he knew I was writing this book, wanted to come talk to me about ways to pay for the university to honor Long's contribution. But I think most students don't know that much about him. I mean, they see his name on the building, but there's really, and I'm not one who's arguing that we need a big statue of Huey Long or anything like that. So right. That's not my reason for all of this. But there really, other than the field house and his name on there's really nothing on campus that has his name or really says who this guy was and what he meant to this university. His son Russell has a statue, but Huey doesn't. But it just felt. I think that more people ought to know about it, and I think more people ought to know about it because I think it's relevant for today, because I think it's, we can learn something from what this guy did, good and bad. But I try to focus on the good stuff that if we really set our minds to it, we could do a lot of good in a short period of time. We just got to resolve to do it. And so that's not the only reason. I think it's just a quirking good story, but that's one of the reasons I want more people to know about it is that, hey, maybe it might inspire us to do it again.
Yeah. And I don't know, just for an example, Middleton Library, like where that's at in terms of renovation or rebuilding, is that moving forward? How's that going?
Yes and no. The legislature appropriated about $3 million in planning money, but it'll cost $150 million to build a new library, and I don't see that money showing up anytime soon. LSU is sort of spinning it that it's almost there, but it's really not. And so I don't know. I mean, it's just a lot of money. It's a lot of money. And they tried to raise it from private sources, and that just didn't happen. So I think it's really going to be pretty much either self-generated or state appropriations is the only way that new library is going to happen.
And I'm guessing, as usual, they don't want to raise taxes. They don't want to raise tuition or fees or whatever.
No, I don't think. I mean, they did it to build the rec center, which was about $100 million, and there was a plan floating around to do it with the library, but that kind of fell through. But the thing that I always say to people is, can you imagine Huey Long letting that library molder for 10, 20 years. I mean, he would be so ashamed that his university had a library that had trash cans on the top floor to collect the rainwater. He wouldn't stand for that for 6 months, much less 6 to 10 years. And I just think he'd probably sell a bridge to pay for it. But so
Yeah.
his methods of finding the solution to the problem might be questionable, but he wouldn't let the problem linger. And I think that's what I hope that people who read the book and hear me speak about it will say, hey, maybe we should adopt a little bit of Huey's urgency about getting these problems addressed.
Yeah, and at the sake of seeming nostalgic for Huey Long's brand of politics, there was, that like genuine desire to improve the university. And I mean, if the library needed money, I'm sure he would have found it. And they could use a little bit more of that now. Obviously, it's just a different political climate. He did, I think, have more of a socialist agenda to some degree. Did a lot of shady things. But I'm thinking of education. I think he was trying to do good. I don't think, you talk about the end of the book, this is a whites only university for a long time. So that's obvious. But at the same time, I think he's trying to help, poor kids and people that had never gone to college, their family had never gone to college. But just to kind of break it down, we've talked a lot of the good that he's done. Maybe what are some of the things that maybe he did that were not so great long-term for LSU? And maybe it's not just a Huey problem. Maybe it's a Louisiana problem. Maybe it's a Southern problem. I don't know. But talk about the legacy a bit.
Well, so the thing that I think that he clearly did that was harmful. Well, there are two things. He politicized the university to a degree that was really harmful, not just while he was at LSU, but for years after that. I mean, it was just totally politicized, and it still is to I think an unhealthy degree, where it's still appointment to the LSU Board of Supervisors is still a choice political plum in the state that is given to the governor's biggest donors and best friends. And I think that has not served the university well, because these are generally not people who care about much beyond LSU football. They certainly are not people who spend any time in the classroom or know much about higher education. And so it's that has not really changed too much. And I think that's probably not unique to Louisiana, but it is one of the negative parts of Huey's legacy, how he politicized the university. What Huey did while he was alive, which was bad for the university, was that he took away. I mean, they had no institutional control. I mean, the LSU board wasn't in charge of the university. The president wasn't in charge of the university. Huey Long was in charge of the university. And when I talk about him, when I go around and speak about it, I have to remind people that, wait a minute, most of what I'm talking about that he did at LSU was while he was a United States senator. He wasn't even governor. You could maybe say the governor has the right to boss the state college around, but he wasn't even governor for a lot of that time. He was a United States senator. And he would brag that I'm in charge of LSU. And he was. I mean, it was the truth. He was really running the university. And this school had lost institutional control. And because of that, they were about to lose their accreditation. The law school was about to lose its accreditation. And the whole school was about to lose its accreditation from the SACS accrediting body. And it was only his assassination, only his death in September of 1935 that saved the law school and the larger university from that fate. Yeah,
that's pretty disturbing. And well, as you say, he's senator, but he pretty much is governor too. I mean, he's
yes, right.
It's really it's crazy. What do you think in terms of priorities? What are they now at LSU, and is that possibly a legacy of the 20s and 30s in terms of athletics versus academics? How do you think that balance is maintained?
Yeah, well, there is no balance. I mean,
right.
it's
yeah.
There's no balance at all. It's all we're a football team with a pretty good history department. So that's the problem, and that's not just a LSU problem. I mean, this is a Southern football problem. This is a higher education problem writ large. I mean, it's not just even the South anymore. Even in Long's time, when he was emphasizing football, these the coaches were being paid $7,000 a year. The assistant coach I love, the fact that Fred Rabenhorst, who was the assistant football coach, was also the coach of the basketball and the baseball team.
Yeah.
He was coaching three sports, and he was the head coach of two of them. And they were pretty good teams,
Yeah.
It was a time when, the athletics on this campus were important, but the money was not what it is today. And so it was important, but I think I got to think that even people like Huey Long would be sort of appalled at what happened, wouldn't understand all this.
That's saying something.
Yeah. So, the thing that this book has taught me is that I'm not as hostile to the presence of football on this campus, because after all, it is a big part of the history of this school, and you can't take that. I don't think it'd be wise or right to take that away. And it is a big part of why the school rose to prominence in the 30s, and we ought to acknowledge that. And I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating it. But in Huey's time, there was a balance. There was a I don't know if you could say it was an equal emphasis. It might have been greater emphasis on the academics as far as money went in those days. Probably was to build it, that you couldn't just do it all on the backs of a football team. It had to be. You had to have the facilities. You had to have the faculty. You had to have you had to have the infrastructure to educate these kids. And I think we kind of lost that. I mean, we've let the library molder. The physical facility of the campus non-athletic department side is just falling apart in so many ways. And the state doesn't care. The legislators don't care. The school leadership seems inadequate. Just they don't know what to do about it. And I'm not saying they're not trying and they don't want to do anything about it, but there's not a whole lot of creativity there. Meanwhile, athletics is just eating high on the hog.
Yeah.
No problems. And in fact, the best example of how the legislature looks on this is that, the library, the LSU's been asking for money for the library for forever. And the minute that LSU wins a national championship in women's basketball, the coach goes to the legislature a couple of months ago and just happens to say, hey, we need more money for a new basketball arena. And the legislators fell all over themselves to try to give her the money for that new arena.
Yeah. Again, I started there back in the 90s. It sounds like it's just gotten worse. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Hard to believe that could actually get worse.
Yeah.
It's a monster. Do you think was there a tipping point with that? Was it maybe the 80s, or like when did you see that balance really getting out of whack?
Well, it was always out of whack in the 80s, even, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe even before then, it was always a little bit out of whack. I mean, one of the things I mentioned in the book is it happened in the 50s when the athletic director who'd worked under Huey Long, a guy named Skipper Hurd, got into a tiff with the president over whether they would spend $1 million on improvements to the football stadium or to the library. And the football stadium won, and the president resigned.
Wow.
And so even then, there was when it came down to it, library, football stadium, we're going with the football stadium. But I think what really changed in this state was in the 2009, 2010, that period when Bobby Jindal became governor and presided over, a massive cut in state taxes, which blew $1 billion hole in the state budget and forced Louisiana to cut higher education and healthcare, the only two areas that aren't constitutionally protected in the state, or legally or constitutionally protected from cuts. And so when big cuts happen, they go disproportionately in Louisiana to higher education and healthcare. I don't know why that is, but that's just the way it is. And so we've never recovered from those deep cuts that came in 2009, 2010, 2012.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a true story for a lot of places, but as you say, probably a lot worse in Louisiana, and a place like LSU, which was already out of whack in terms of priorities. And it's frustrating because it's not an either or. I mean, you can have a first-rate university and a good football team. You see it at
Right.
other schools, and even in the South, even in the deep South, it's true.
Yep. Go to Georgia,
Yeah, so it's very frustrating, but as we've talked about before, it's not really going to change anytime soon. So I guess just enjoy your research, enjoy your teaching. I can't believe you said your book on Jimmy Davis might be done next year.
Yeah, it's my deadline to hand it over to LSU Press is January, so
Oh wow, okay.
I've finished the first draft, and I'm just now
Right.
doing my editing.
All right. Well, I will look forward to having you back next year, Bob, to talk about that. I think that'll be a good segue going from Long to Jimmy Davis. Different time period, obviously. But
Well, that would be fun. I would love.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I would love to come back. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I really enjoyed the conversation. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I did. I've been. I don't know. Maybe we talked a little about Huey last time, but this is really fun to kind of deep dive. So appreciate your time and taking time out of your Saturday morning. So thanks a lot, Bob.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it, and you'll share it with me when it's posted, so I can share them.
Absolutely. Yeah. LSU Press. Way to go.
All right.
All right.
Thanks, Colin.
Bob. All right. That was my talk with Robert Mann. His book is Kingfish U, Huey Long and LSU. You can get the book for $21.30 on Amazon. You can get that is the hardcover price for $14.99 on Kindle. Now, those prices might change, but that's what it was as of Sunday, September 3rd, which I think is the LSU football team's first game of the year. I can't remember who they're playing, Florida State maybe? But anyway, they're playing today. They usually play Saturday, but I guess they're playing on Sunday, unless I read it wrong. And it's just interesting how much football there is on TV now. It used to be just Saturday was college, Sunday was NFL, and you maybe have one Monday game, but now it seems like just about every day of the week there's a football game on. Anyway, it is huge at LSU. It's not going to change, but if you want to know more about how that all happened, and it's really probably a story about most of the South and the big universities that have enormous football programs and budgets, check it out. Robert Mann's book. It is still hot here in Richmond. I think it's going to be in the 90s pretty much all week. So we're keeping the pool open. You never know with September. Sometimes it cools down around Labor Day, other times not so much. The kids started before Labor Day, unfortunately, and AC was not working great in Henrico County, but the kids got through that, and they had Friday off before Labor Day, so that was nice. They got a 4-day weekend, so I'm not really understanding why they have to start before Labor Day if they're going to get the extended weekend and have classrooms with shitty air conditioning. So not too happy about that and the shorter summer, but I'm going to have to write some letters to the people in charge. This has been the first year, and don't think anyone really likes it. I don't know. Not anyone that I've talked to. But yeah, catching up on reading this week and some writing over the long weekend, and wanted to finish this podcast and get it out there for you and send the link to Bob. I hope you are doing well. I will talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.